Well, welcome everyone. Thanks for coming and listening to our webinar today. This is the last one in the August webinar series. And today we're very excited about the PowerApps Component Framework. What we'll look at over the next hour is, first of all, just a 1 or 2 minute overview of the PowerApps Component Framework. Now, one of the things that is a little bit tricky is setting up for PCF development. So we're going to kind of step through how to get the command line tools. It's a little bit Node.js and a little bit Visual Studio with MS Build. So I've worked with things like the SharePoint framework and the tools for Power BI custom visuals. And this is very similar, but there's a couple curveballs here that I didn't get with the other two that we're going to go through. We're going to step through creating and running a project inside their debugging environment, a little local test harness. We'll also talk about how to test components in the PowerApps environment, and there's some neat new additions to the PowerApps tools. Also along the way, there's a bunch of PCF sample projects for Microsoft, and I really encourage that we look at those as well as we go through our learning. So what is the PowerApps Component Framework? It is a framework for developers for creating HTML-based components that we can run in PowerApps. Now, this framework is still in preview. It will eventually support both model-driven apps and Canvas apps. Today, it only supports model-driven apps. So you can create a PCF component that binds to a single field in a CDS data source, a CDS entity, or you can build one based on a data set, which basically gives you a rectangular set of data, so you can build something like a grid. Now, coming down the road, we'll be able to create components for Canvas apps, that don't have any predetermined binding. Now, once we create components using this framework, one of the really neat things is that our components just get packaged and get deployed in regular PowerApps solutions. Same things they're using in Dynamics 365, same things that we can use throughout the PowerApps environment once we start using the Common Data Service. Now, there's a great place to get started. So if you haven't been to this location yet, I just want to point you to, that doesn't look like where I meant to go. Let's go back over here. So the Component Framework Overview, like most of the other documentation now, it lives in docs.microsoft.com. And so in just a second, we'll go through the tooling, but this is a good reference to have on hand. Okay, now what we're going to see with the Component Framework is that we're going to start programming in TypeScript. So if you haven't programmed in TypeScript yet, that's going to be a new thing for you. I suspect that some of you have started using SharePoint Framework and or the tools for creating Power BI custom visuals, and you've already kind of gone through the learning curve of working with TypeScript and working with the Node.js environment. Now, what's going to happen is that you're going to create a TypeScript class that inherits from a TypeScript class as part of the PCF APIs. And this base class automatically hooks you into contextual data and metadata. For instance, if you're bound to a particular first name field on the contact entity, there's an API for you to discover what the metadata is, for the hosting entity and for the hosting field. Now, also, the APIs allow you to do things such as make web service calls out to some endpoint on the internet. There's utilities for doing things like formatting values into currency and dates. And one of the new places that they're going to start growing out APIs is for device features. So the component framework is definitely targeting mobile devices as one of the things that we can develop for. And if your device is run on an iPhone or an Android, being able to leverage the camera or determine the location or being able to open up the microphone, are things that the APIs are beginning to work with. And of course, because it's an HTML-based framework, there's going to be UI elements, such as you being able to call a method that brings up a modal dialog, or at least the HTML equivalent of a modal dialog. Now, let's go through setting up your PCF environment. So one of the things that you're going to need is Node.js. You can install the latest LTS version. It's a 10 point something these days. So, generally that's the preferred version of Node.js. If I go back here and I go ahead and start up my Node.js command line, I can see that I'm running 10.16. Okay, and then also we're going to need to have some type of development environment. Note that Node.js, the big reason that we need Node.js is that it installs NPM or Node Package Manager, and the projects that we create are going to require that we use the NPM command to do things like run the PowerApps component development scripts that are built into our projects. Now, we're going to use any development environment we want, that is, friendly to Node.js development. And so generally Visual Studio Code is going to work a lot better than Visual Studio. Now, when you develop with Visual Studio Code, note that they have a built-in terminal. Just as for instance, let's say that I go down to my my working directory here, and let's go ahead and create a new folder, and I'll call that my project. Once I create this particular project, I am going to right-click on it and choose Open with Code. And so now I have an empty project, but if you haven't used Visual Studio Code, when you're using a command line driven environment like Node.js and what we're going to see with the PCF tools, we want to open up the terminal. Now, let's say that I was doing something like straightforward development with Node.js. So if I call npm init, and then I basically put -y, it basically says initialize this project. So if you see a package.json file, you're in a Node.js project. Okay. Also, when we're working with Node.js projects, such as we will be in a few minutes when I start working with PCF, we also have other npm commands, such as install. And if I say something like npm install jQuery, that is how I install libraries. But what I'm getting at is you need kind of a basic proficiency with the npm tool and the Node.js environment, to work with the PCF component framework. Okay, all done with this example. Let's go ahead and close that down. Just wanted to kind of get started. Now, we're going to use a tool that is built by the PowerApps PCF team, and it's called the PowerApps CLI. So there is a download link, and if I go back here under Get Tooling, some of the things that we have to do here is install NPM and Node.js, install the .NET Framework 4.6.2 development pack, and here I have to kind of call out that currently in preview, this tooling is only supported on Windows 10. There's a big push towards cross-platform. Where's the cross-platform? It will come, just not in the preview. There's a lot of work that had to be done building solutions, bringing Dynamics 365 solution packaging technology forward. And so because of that, they are using MS Build, which is not as much a Node.js thing as something you get when you install Visual Studio. So in addition to installing Node.js and this pack, if you have Visual Studio 2017 installed, it installs all the MS Build stuff that you need. If not, here are some recommendations of how you can install .NET Core. Okay, and down here where it says install the Microsoft PowerApps CLI, when you click on that, it downloads an MSI file, and you basically install the MSI file on your local machine. Once you've done that, if I go back here and I want to look at a command and I basically run pack, that is the top level command. And what we see is that pack has different commands like pack auth, pack org, pack PCF, pack solution. Okay. Now, let's go ahead, and we've got the tools set up, and we want to create our first project. Now, before I go through the demo, what you're going to see is that when you develop a new project or a new component, that component will have a manifest, and the manifest is in XML, not JSON. We then have a component implementation in TypeScript, and you can also have component resources. So you can add in resource files for things like localized strings. Okay, I'm not going to use that in my demo, but it is possible if you need that and you're doing kind of true development that requires localization. Now, the component manifest is going to have a name, space, and a name of a component. Now, today, remember I said that we don't yet in the preview support Canvas apps. We only support model-driven apps, and so we really kind of support common data service entities. So when you create your component, you either say, I am a field, and I bind to a single fielded entity, or I am a data set, and I basically bind to a record set behind an entity. Now, your component can define properties, and so one of the things that you're going to see is that other builders, today building model-driven apps, soon using Canvas apps will drop your component on their design surface, and you're able to create custom properties that they can put input values for. Your component can also have output properties, and quite often that's the value of your component, that it does some type of calculation and basically has an output property that the hosting application is able to read. Okay. Now, there's also going to be this TypeScript class that we're going to get inside there. Now, let's go ahead and just do our first example here. What I was trying to do is make it nice and pretty so you can kind of see this thing running, and as it runs, what gets created. It basically fills up that folder with a package.json file. So the package.json file is what any Node.js project has. Also note that if I type in code, which will start Visual Studio Code, I do a space and then a dot, it will open Visual Studio Code at that particular folder. Okay, so now let's go ahead and bring up our view terminal. And now that we have this thing here, we can basically look at the new project. So there is this folder, linear input control, and what we see is that there is an XML file, so that is the manifest, and there's an index.ts file, that is the implementation. So let's open up the manifest first of all. Okay, once again, I think you probably prefer JSON over XML, but this is something where XML has been brought forward from all the Dynamics 365 solution architecture. So that's why the team has, put this, into this format. Now, let's say that I want to create some properties. So what I'm going to do is, first thing, I'm going to create not really a property yet, but I'm going to create something which is going to act as the type that I can use for a property. So I have a type group, and I'm going to just name it numbers. And note that with my type, I want to basically say any of these four basic types is fine. Whole number, currency, floating point, or decimal. All those will work fine. Okay, now after I've basically created something that kind of acts as a type, well, now we'll go ahead and we'll create an actual property. And this particular property is going to be called slider value, and got some descriptions, got some names. Down below, I'm going to go ahead and get rid of what's inside there. And note that I'm not going to be using any features here, but if you want to use different parts of the API, you have to kind of declare that. Okay, now one of the things that we can do is we can add some extra CSS, which is basically going to be part of this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go right in the top level folder. We're going to create a new folder, and that's going to be the CSS folder. In the CSS folder, I'm going to right click, I'm going to say new file, and we're going to create this file, and the file is just going to be called mylinearcontrol.cs. Now, here I kind of pre-did some things to kind of go quickly here, but we're just going to kind of copy and paste some code inside here, and note that we have something where we have dot, and that is the name of the namespace, and that is the name of the particular control itself. And once we have added that inside, one more thing that we have to do to basically add our CSS into the build process, is to come down here, into the resources. And, at this point now we have ability to use the CSS. Okay, and now finally let's go and kind of take a look at the code that, we're going to actually write to bring the custom visual to life. Okay, now inside here, one of the things that we're going to see is that when you first create your project, some things might not work or might not compile. And that's because when you create a project, it hasn't yet done the npm install. And so after you create the project, you run the npm install. This is kind of the opposite of SharePoint Framework, which as you create the project, it loads in all the packages. This is the opposite. It does not load in the packages. So once this loads in, it should then recognize, all the different types from the underlying framework. You can see that when you create a class, there is a base class, standard control, that has both inputs and outputs. Okay. Now, another thing that you might note is that here we have some code that's saying context.parameters.slider value, and they're not compiling. And the reason for that is that they take a look at the properties as defined inside of your manifest. And then during the build process, they actually build out a TypeScript type to match what you've done inside here. So once again, I go back here, these things aren't working. And now we'll do an npm run build. So npm run build will basically run a build script. And one of the things it does is it basically runs a piece of code that looks at that XML and basically builds the TypeScript code so that now as you're looking at your parameters inside here, all of a sudden, they are going to be strongly typed inside. Okay, now once you've kind of got your project up and going, the next thing, that we're going to want to do is we're going to want to test the project out. Let's go back up here. And so let me open up the package.json file. If you open the package.json file, you can see the scripts. So when you do an npm run build, it basically runs PCF scripts and passes the build command. What we want to do is we want to test things out. So we're going to say npm run start. Okay, so if I say npm run start, and we go ahead and crank this thing up, what we should see here is this new test harness. Now, the test harness has been around for a while, but they just revamped it and did some really nice things to it. So, for instance, if I have a well-known set of width and height parameters to fit into, I could basically start moving this around and kind of testing what happens if I only have this much real estate to work with. Okay, that's nice. Also, you have data inputs. Now, let me go ahead and stop this for a second. And I'm going to come back to this in just a second. But what I want to do is let's go back to some of the samples. So Microsoft has a bunch of sample projects, and they're very easy to use. So let's go to sample projects right here. And, let's say that I go look at the simple one for, not a field, the one I'm creating, but this one is data set. So it basically has a view of kind of a rectangle or a table. Let's go ahead and open that with code. And now that I've done that, when you open one of these projects, it's just npm I. Let's go ahead and make sure that we do the install, which basically says look at the package.json file and restore all the different Node.js packages that aren't installed. And now we'll do npm run start. And in this case right here, as I run and start, we're going to use that same debugging surface, except this one goes for, something a little bit different. Now, let's go back here. And this is another new thing that just came out over the last couple days. Let's say that I have some type of a CSV file. So here I have just a couple different dogs inside here. So I want to go ahead and test this. So if I come down here where it says data input, select a file, I can now go through here and select my own data file and go ahead and choose apply. And now what you see is that my data loads inside. So we haven't pushed into the PowerApps environment yet. So this is just an HTML test harness, but you being able to upload your own data set of mock data, so that you can work on this without having to be connected to Dynamics 365 or the PowerApps environment, gets to be a big, nice advantage. Okay, now you've seen me use this. I'm going to go ahead and stop. Generally, we can only have one of these things running at a time. So if you have two different versions of Visual Studio Code open, don't leave the debugger running in one while you try to use the other. Okay, now that we've done that, let's say that we want to now build this project. So what I'm going to do now is this time I'm going to go back over to the developer command prompt. Somehow it choked when I gave it the command to do the build. But now what we want to do is let's actually see how we build this thing into a package. Okay, so I guess I'll do the first part with the command prompt. Okay, I think you should be able to get one command prompt doing everything, but it seems like I'm going to have to do some things in the Node.js command prompt and some things just because of the way I set up my environment. Okay, so let's say that I want to create a solution. So we'll make a directory, my CDS solution. And now that we've made that directory, let's go ahead and work by kind of going into that directory. Now, the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to initialize this folder with a command that will make it a solution. Inside of that folder, let's run that command. And as I run that command, you kind of see it builds out a solution file. Okay, now the next thing that we have to do is we have to basically point to the project that has the input control. And if we add that, and now we've successfully added a reference to that particular project. Okay, so we basically created a folder, initialized it as a solution. We ran a command to add a reference to my particular project. Okay, now here's the point where I'm going to bring the Visual Studio command prompt in because it knows MS build. So if I go back and we'll CD into that same folder, and once I get into that folder, which is the top level solution folder, we should be able to say MS build, and at first we have to run the restore command, basically to restore packages that this thing needs, and then after we have done that, now we're just going to do a MS build, and when I do the MS build, the build files are there. It should be able to kind of generate the output. And when I'm all done, what we should be able to confirm down here under bin and debug, there is the actual solution. So here's something where I now should be able to go back into PowerApps. I should be able to go, to my environment right here. And now I should be able to import that solution. Okay, now while you can do that, what you're going to see is that they've given us a much easier way, if all you're doing is doing some quick development, to do just what I showed right there. So in general, what you're going to do is you're going to run a command which is basically going to create a profile with your credentials so that you can basically upload things kind of on the fly back into the environment. Okay, I think I could be more clear with what I want to do here. But what you're going to see here is that there is this one particular command that I can run here. And so if I go back, cd, and I run this command, which is pack auth create, that will kind of lead me through a process of being able to log in. So now I can log into my environment. Once I have logged into my environment, it's able to take that credential and cache that. Note that if I did a pack auth and I think it's list, now I can kind of see I basically created the same profile for myself twice just to show you how to do that. But one of these, is going to be the active profile. Okay, now what do I do, to be able to push this out and actually test it in the environment? And note that this doesn't even require MS build. So back here, what we're going to do is we're going to do this command, which is pack PCF push publisher prefix CPT. And note that when you create that profile like I just did, you have to either be the system administrator or system configurator or system configuration permissions. System customizer, I believe, is the term I was trying to come up with. But now, and I think that as long as I do a hyphen, I should be able to now push this out with that pack PCF push. And as we push this out, it's basically just building a temporary solution, and it's basically going to push it, automatically out into the environment that I told it to. Okay, and now once we've done that, if we come back here and we basically refresh, hey, now I can see that we've got this component inside here. If I take a look at that, there's the linear control that I'm creating. Okay, now let's put this to use. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to create an entity in a quick model-driven app so I can use this control. So let's go to entities, and let's say that we're going to have a new, let's see, we'll have a fun game, and let's say that with the fun game, which is going to be an entity, it'll have a player who played, and it'll have a score. Okay, so let's go down here and we'll kind of change this to player name. We'll go ahead, we'll say create, and then we're just going to add one field in here, and I'm going to add a field that we can use to test our component. Okay, so we'll add a field, and that will be the score. And for that particular score, let's say we want it to be a whole number. If I wanted it to have a minimum and maximum, I could add that inside, but I think we'll just go ahead and choose done. And now I'll choose save entity. Okay, and now that we have that, let's go ahead and I'm going to go to apps. And I'm going to say, let's create a new model-driven app. So remember, components are supported in model-driven apps, but not, inside of Canvas apps quite yet. Let's go ahead and choose done. And so what I'll do is with this new model-driven app, I'll basically have it simply look at that new entity that we just created. So if we go down here and we look for fun game, there's our fun game. Let's go ahead and hit save. Let's go ahead and hit publish. And now let's go ahead and close the sitemap. Okay, so now if I go down and we look at the forms, what we can see is that there's going to be this main form. So let's go ahead and open it up. And let's run it once before we add our control in. So I'm going to come back here and I'm going to take score, and I'm just going to see what is the component that comes out of the box. Let's go ahead and do a save. Let's go ahead and publish. And now that we have published this, we should be able to save and publish the model-driven app itself. And now let's go ahead and run it. And as I create a new game, okay, we have the player Chuck, and let's say, what did Chuck get? Test, and notice that this is a number field, so we have to use that number field inside here. And okay, somehow my app just quit, or I've lost my screen. Okay, let me try it one more time. Okay, so enter a number. You can kind of see, that works. Okay, so let's go ahead and switch and add our component in now. So if we go down here and we go into the editor, and note that this is still the old editor. It hasn't switched over to the new editor yet, because what I'm about to do, works in the old editor, but not the new editor yet. But I pick this particular field, and right now it's just using a regular old text box. So now we choose Change Properties. Once the Change Properties dialog comes up, I should be able to go over to the very last tab, which is the Controls tab. And I'm going to say Add Control. And so I should be able to look down here and see there's a bunch of different controls. And now here's this one particular control that we're going to go ahead and add in. And note that once you add the control in, we still need to kind of come through and decide, do we want it in the web scenario? That's the one we're going to see. But you also want that one in the phone and tablet. So you get to pick on a per basis scenario. Let's go ahead and choose OK. And so now that we've done that, we should be able to save. And once I save, next we'll go ahead and publish. And now that we've done that, let's go ahead and close it out. Let's go ahead, run it one more time. And now if I go ahead and choose new, now we have our slider control inside there. Okay, so now we have Ted. And what we can see here is that the slider control we can use. We can go ahead and hit save. And now we've kind of taken it and saved it back. Okay. So, what's nice about what we have currently is that, let's go back here. And so you kind of saw that I was able just to create a project. I was able to build and test the project in the local test harness. And then we were able to just use a command line option to create a temporary solution, push it into my environment, and then kind of use it in some type of a scenario. Okay, now, as I want to make changes in this, let's say we come back here, and now we have npm run start. And in particular, let's do CLS. npm run start. And for some reason, all the other commands, other than start, you have to say run. But here we just have to say start. Okay, that's a little piece of trivia. That's not important. But what is important is that they've just now recently supported adding watch. And the idea of watch is, let's go ahead and run this right here. And as I run this right here, and now let's say that I go back to something such as my CSS, and can I find something where I can go ahead and kind of change the color to something a little bit more drastic. Okay, so if I take this and let's change this to purple, and if I change it to purple in a couple different places. Okay, not doing this demo as well as I should, but what I'm kind of trying to show here is that if you make changes to either your TypeScript or your CSS, change detected, it rebuilds and basically pushes the changes out there. Okay, so we have that, and then also after you've kind of done testing locally, you can also push changes out using that exact same command that we saw before. So for instance, let's say that now I've kind of tested locally, and after testing locally, I want to go ahead and push back into the environment again. So now I can simply, push the new build on top of the old build. And the idea is it's supposed to swap it out, with minimal impact. And you can imagine some of the earlier scenarios when you developed and you had to do all the click, click, click to extract the package, put the new one back in. And so, now you have this whole kind of round trip of getting, the new input one inside there. And now all I have to do is go back and basically refresh, the page that's showing my component. So there's some pretty neat things because of that. Okay, now let's look a little bit more at the API itself. So if I go back here and we kind of open up this file, which is the index.ts file, what you'll see is that when you create one of these components, you create a TypeScript class that inherits from component framework standard controls. You have these two parameterized interfaces, I inputs and I outputs. And what's really neat is that you will basically change what's in the manifest. And here, I basically just have a input property, but properties can be input or input output. And the idea is that when you build your project, it takes what it finds here in this XML and basically creates types in your project to define what are the inputs and what are the outputs. So that makes it so that when I'm down here and, we basically look at, dot sliders, basically you have a slider value because that is a property, that has been added inside there. Okay. Now, some of the other things to note is that the main thing that we do is that we implement an init method. So the init method comes in and it basically passes me context that gives me, basically all the input parameters. Think of that as the properties that I wanted the host to set. So when my component starts its life, it can see what these properties are. Okay. Now, there's also a notify output change. And so basically this is something where you have a function that you're, able to keep a reference to. And the idea is when it's time for an output change, you simply call that. And when your output properties change, you might not want your host to care. But if the output properties change and you want your host to, see what they are, you basically just call that method, notify output change. So it's a common pattern that during this initialization method, we basically just take this and we point to, some other method inside here. So for instance, down here, you can see that when we refresh the data, we might need to do something, such as go look at the input value, refresh it, but now we basically need to call notify output change, to basically let the host know that there are new values in the output properties for this component. Okay, and then there's also get outputs. So what happens is you'll call notify output change, the host will call get outputs, and now you just return an object, and we have basically one property that's an input-output property here. But here you can see that's how I return that particular property. Okay. So now that you've seen that, let's go ahead and I want to just kind of reiterate some of the things we looked at. So by calling pack auth create URL, you basically create and cache a local profile that has, your credentials. So when you run the pack PCF push command, it basically uses those credentials to, basically connect with the identity of you. And as long as you are system administrator or a system customizer, you'll be able to push your changes, inside there. And so that gets to be, a really nice part of the development story, being able to push out your changes. Okay. Let's go back. And one of the things that, you can see if you go back to their documentation, let's go back to PCF here, and that is that they have some sample components. And you can download all the sample components. And this is what I've been doing just to kind of go through and kind of absorb all the different ways that they've bound to data, all the different ways that they've created properties, in the manifests. Okay, and there's one particular one I want to look at. So I'm going to go down here to Open Folder, and if I look through the Microsoft samples down here, which is the one, there's one which is the React Standard Control. Okay, I like this one. Microsoft's very proud of this one. But let's go ahead and open this up. And when I open this up, what you can see is that if I look at the package, it's using React, 16.8, fairly modern version. And because I have React, I can also use the Office UI Fabric React components. So what's neat about this is you don't have to do all the UI. If you can find React component libraries, you can use those. Now, let's say that I start this up. So when you open this up, it's going to be npm install or npm I. And then we should be able just to do a npm start. And as I do this npm start, and now this thing starts running right here. Here is, what this looks like. You basically are able to kind of move things back and forth. And they have this message up top here, React version in control, React version in host window. So in this preview, the builders of PCF know that, when you're on a PowerApps Dynamics 365 page, that the React library is already loaded on the page. And what they're trying to do, but they haven't been able to do yet, is to kind of integrate this, into the React library that's already running. So in the preview, they've basically said, we're going to create our own separate link to React and isolate it. But in the long run, we're going to get rid of that so that you'll be able to kind of do the same thing here, but there won't be two different versions, of React on the page. Okay, so that's what we have moving forward. But now let's move inside here. And what you'll see is that there is this base pile control. And if I look inside of index.ts, somewhere inside here, what we'll see is that there is going to be code which is able to basically take our component, React DOM, render, React create element, and facepile basic example. So what you're seeing is that they're just kind of bootstrapping, your component, into a brand new React DOM. Okay. But as I mentioned, what we should expect, as this comes out of preview to GA, is that they will change the model such that we're just kind of plugging into a React DOM, that the page has created, and that will be far more efficient once that happens. Okay. And what I can see here too is that if I come back here and I start looking at when someone is working with this UI right here, and they're kind of using, some of these neat controls, what are they working with? They're working with React components that are just basically built into the Office UI Fabric React. So here is this drop down that they put inside here. And you can see that, if you're able to create your React components, in this particular fashion, and that's how you develop for PCF, that's a pretty neat productivity boost just to be able to just use React and TSX files in and of itself, but then to be able to use some of the components from the Office UI Fabric, gets to be, also very enabling. Okay, so I think at this point, I've covered the things that I wanted to cover today. I definitely would encourage you to look at those PCF samples. If I take just a second to give you a word about what we do at Critical Path Training. If I go to Critical Path Training, and let's say that one of the things that you are interested in is kind of taking some, more advanced PowerApps training. So the one course that we have, if you haven't taken a look at it, is Building Business Solutions with PowerApps and Flow. So with this particular class, one of the things that we're able to do is, cover Canvas apps in pretty good depth, talking to things like SQL Server and SharePoint, cover Flow for a whole day, and then start drilling down on the Common Data Service and building managed solutions. And, starting with the September delivery, we're going to add a module on working with the PowerApps portal.